Hello everybody and welcome to our Valuing Nature webinar this afternoon. We'll start the webinar now. I think it's 1 o'clock. It looks like people have joined us. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Anita Weatherby. I'm the Programme Manager for the Valuing Nature Programme Coordination Team. I'm based at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And we're hosting this today, myself along with my colleague Victoria Barlow, who's based here at CH with me. So what we'll do today, I'll give you a very brief introduction to the Valuing Nature programme. Then I'll hand over to Richard Payne from the University of York, who will talk about his report on the natural capital trade-offs in afforested peatlands. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please do type those in as we go along. You should be able to find a question box on your interface, and we'll pick all of those up after Richard has given his talk. So the Valuing Nature programme is a 5-year investment from 4 research councils and from DEFRA. Its intention is to improve how we make decisions about the natural environment by considering all sorts of different ways of doing valuation. So that includes financial valuation, but right the way through the different interests of these different research councils. So you'll notice particularly we have the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Economic and Social Science Research Council, and the Biological and Bioscience Research Council, as well as the Natural Environment Research Council and DEFRA. And the recognition here is that we need to work across all of these different discipline areas to really consider the different types of values that human beings take into account. And the aim of the programme is up there on the slide to help us better understand and represent the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analysis, and particularly to consider the wider social and cultural value of ecosystem services. This £7 million programme then was established with 3 goals in mind. The first of which is part of what we're doing today. It's about building this Valuing Nature network, so helping people understand better concepts and questions across different disciplines, build that interdisciplinary research capability for the UK, and bring together researchers with people from the worlds of business, policy and practitioners to better understand how we use that research in making decisions. So towards that goal, we've been running a Valuing Nature programme coordination team and running a series of events and activities to help build that network. The kind of things we've done, we've had an annual conference every year for the last 3 or 4 years. We've funded a series of placements where individuals can go and work in a different discipline area for 3 months or a different applied area. We've run activities on business engagement through a business interest group where various UK businesses have explained to us the risks and the opportunities and the interests they have in valuation. And we've brought researchers into that business world. We've run a business impact school for early career researchers to hear directly from businesses about how they make decisions about the natural environment and to better understand how to translate our academic outputs into business decision making. We've also run a series of what we call demystifying publications, where we've brought experts together to explain some of the concepts from one discipline to users who are not specialists in that field. So, for example, we have one of those about demystifying economics in the context of decisions about the natural environment, and another about demystifying health. As well as the work to build a network, there are 2 research topics within the Valuing Nature programme. The first of those is human health and well-being, so better understanding the role of the natural environment in supporting human health, both physical and mental and well-being. And there are 4 major research projects in that area. And finally, the research area on ecosystem stocks and tipping points. And that's about understanding better the relationships between the stocks we have of different types of ecosystems, the services that we get from those ecosystems, and how those translate into benefits to humans. And the aim being to define and better understand where the critical levels of those stocks are that might avoid abrupt and damaging change in the delivery of benefits, these tipping points. If you haven't already, please do sign up to the Valuing Nature Network. The website address is up there. We currently have about 2,000 members of the network and about 4,000 followers on Twitter. And if you sign up, you'll receive occasional newsletters and information of events and activities and funding opportunities that might be of interest to you. So one of the major concepts in the world of valuation, valuing nature, is the concept of natural capital. And we know that this is very high up the agendas of policymakers right across the UK. We also know there's a bit of a mismatch between what we know as academics about the natural world and how we translate that into the language and concepts of natural capital. So the Valuing Nature programme commissioned a set of reports. We ran an open call and people bid in to win the funding to do this. And as a result, we now have these 5 natural capital synthesis reports where researchers have pulled together information about the current state of knowledge and where the evidence gaps are. Those reports are all on our website. Please do download those if you haven't already. And today we have one of the webinar series about those reports so that you can hear more from the author on that report. So we're halfway through this webinar series now today, with Richard speaking about afforested peatlands. Just to draw your attention to 2 more we have in the next couple of weeks. On the 13th of February, Jess Davis and Victoria James Bassett will tell us about their report on soil natural capital valuation. And they've particularly worked with people in the agri-food businesses about how they're using these approaches and where the opportunities might be. And then on the 19th of February, we'll hear from Rose Pritchard about an analysis she's worked on of monetary natural capital assessment in the private sector, which brings together a series of case studies about how private sector partners have used concept of monetary natural capital assessment. So please do look on the website and sign up for those if those are of interest to you. Okay, it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Richard, but just before I do that, just a reminder that we'll have 15 minutes for questions at the end. Please do type in questions as we go along, and when we get to the end, we'll pause and have a little bit of time then for you to type those in as well. My colleague Victoria will read those out so that Richard can respond, so it'll help us hugely if you can use simple language and spell out any acronyms and abbreviations in your questions. Okay, with no further ado, let me hand over to Richard to tell us about natural capital trade-offs in afforested peatlands. Richard, are you there?
Yes. Thank you for that introduction, Anita. I hope you can all hear me clearly. So in our project, we were interested in the natural capital of peatlands, and specifically in how that changes with afforestation and how we can use the natural capital concept to make decisions about future land use of afforested peatlands. So peatlands are some of our most characteristic landscapes in the UK uplands, and peatlands are some of our wildest, most undisturbed habitats. So we think they have intrinsic importance. But how we structure our discussion of that importance is increasingly in terms of ecosystem services and natural capital. So we talk about the value of peatlands in regulating our natural environment, in regulating our climate through the role of peatlands in taking up carbon, through regulating our water supply. We talk about peatlands in terms of their biodiversity and the value we place on the ecosystem functioning correctly. We also sometimes remember to talk about the cultural role of peatlands. Peatlands give us some of our best windows on past natural and human environments. Peatland environments are central to some of our most popular national parks, and they're important places for pleasure and recreation. And peatlands also have an important part in many other aspects of our culture, from Scotch whisky to the novels of the Bronte sisters. Peatlands also provide us with more immediately apparent services, with provisioning services. But these are somewhat different because many people would say they're intrinsically extractive in nature. So peatlands have and continue to be important as a source of fuel. We use peat for horticulture. Peatland environments are widely used land for agriculture. We use peatlands for energy generation because many of our wind farms are now on peat. And peatlands are also important in terms of forestry and timber supply. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So in the second half of the 20th century, about maybe 15% of UK peatlands were ploughed up like this and planted with non-native conifer trees, with particularly Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine, which are native to North America. This was done for some good reasons and some not so good reasons. It was done to reduce our national reliance on imported timber to meet our requirements. It was done for the purposes of generating employment and economic activity in remote parts of the country. But it was particularly encouraged by a tax regime which made it very financially advantageous for investors to put their money into the afforestation of cheap land like peatlands, which means that large areas of trees were planted on peat in places that even many foresters at the time thought were inappropriate, places with deep, wet peat where it was unlikely that trees were ever going to grow well. So because of this, we now have extensive areas of the country covered in a landscape that looks like this, a monoculture of a non-native species. Habitats like this, these plantations are not being planted anymore. In 1988, the tax incentives that made afforestation of peatlands such a lucrative investment were withdrawn, and about a decade later, the Forestry Commission issued guidance against new afforestation of deep peat. This was done because the planting of trees on peat had become very controversial by that point. There was a considerable public concern about the impact on wildlife, particularly on birds, and particularly focus on the flow country in Caithness and Sutherland. And this became a very acrimonious conflict between conservation organisations and landowners and forestry companies, and to some extent the issues around afforested peatlands in the UK continue to be contentious. So the current situation is that we are not going to create new plantations, but we need to decide what we're going to do with the plantations that we already have. Many of these plantations planted in the 70s and 80s are now reaching harvesting age, and we need to decide what we're going to do with them next. Are we going to continue using them for forestry? Are we going to plant a second rotation of the same trees and continue reaping the economic benefit from that? Or are we going to go for other options? And the central alternative is to consider forest-to-bog peatland restoration. So removing the trees from these plantations, blocking the ditches that lowered the water table and dried the peat surface, and trying to return the habitat to something like its pre-existing state. This is likely to have some benefits in terms of, for instance, biodiversity, but is going to impose a significant financial cost. So we need to make these decisions. There are potentially third way options as well. In Scotland, there is a policy of creating a habitat called peatland edge woodland. And this is where, when we fell those existing non-native conifer plantations, we, instead of restoring to an open peatland, we plant other tree species, native tree species. But this is trying to create a habitat which does not exist in nature in the UK. In the UK, most of our peatlands are naturally open, and we don't have habitat with these native species growing on deep peat. So this idea is controversial. So in our report, we aimed to try and synthesize the evidence around this subject area. And rather than trying to cover all aspects of this complicated subject, we first set out to try and identify what stakeholders in a variety of different organisations and a variety of different roles considered to be the most important questions. And in many ways, it's this synthesis of stakeholders' opinions over what are the key questions that we as scientists need to answer, which is the key output of the project. So we did this through a multi-stage process. So we first issued an open call to the community to nominate what they thought were the key research questions. We then took those responses and went through an editorial process where we reworded and combined the submissions into a smaller number of unique questions. We then put those questions back to the community in a second stage and asked them to vote on which of those questions they considered most important. We then use those responses to structure a discussion of our current knowledge and where the gaps lie. And the full version of that you can see in our published report, but I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the work we did today. So one of the really positive things about this process is that we got really good engagement from the community. We had 126 questions submitted in the first stage of our study, and then 67 individuals voted on our edited questions in the second stage of the study. And those contributors to the project came from a very diverse range of backgrounds. So we had significant numbers of respondents from the forestry industry, from research organisations, from governmental and statutory organisations, from third sector, mostly conservation organisations, and from landowners. And one of the really interesting things is that although participants from those different backgrounds had very different perspectives on the issues, their thoughts on what were the most important research questions actually showed a surprisingly high degree of commonality. So I'm just going to take you through the top 5 of these questions which were contributed by the community. So the first 2 of these, our most popular question and our second most popular question, were both on the subject of climate change. They were, how does the greenhouse gas balance of peatland forestry differ between deep and shallow peat and compared to forestry on mineral soils? And how does the greenhouse gas budget of a peatland change with initial afforestation, restocking and restoration? And I think it's perhaps unsurprising that these questions came through so strongly in our participants' contributions, because the role of peatlands in the climate system is currently one of the major motivations for policy interest in peatland environments and for research interest. The bottom line is, however, that we can't currently give a good answer to even the basic question of whether planting trees on peat makes climate change better or worse. And this diagram is our attempt to summarize the current state of knowledge in a qualitative sort of way. I don't have time to discuss in this presentation all the intricacies of the peatland carbon budget and how it's modified by afforestation and restoration, but I will at least try and convince you why this is a complicated issue. It's complicated firstly because when we're dealing with the greenhouse gas implications of peatlands, we're dealing with not one greenhouse gas, but 2. Peatlands are long-term sinks for carbon dioxide, but they're also sources of methane. And the production of methane is much less in quantity, but methane is a much more effective greenhouse gas than CO2. And the fluxes of both of these gases are modified by our alternative land uses, by afforestation and subsequent restoration. So we expect afforestation to reduce our production of methane from the system, but to increase the fixation of carbon by the vegetation, but simultaneously to increase the loss of CO2 from the peat as that is dried and begins to oxidize. We fundamentally have very little evidence, however, to quantify the relative magnitude of these different fluxes. So we have a good knowledge of some of the processes, but their relative importance is poorly known. And we have no robust carbon budget for any afforested peatland in Britain. And one of our problems here is that what we have done to our peatlands in the UK, draining them, planting them with non-native conifers, is globally unusual. So we don't have a global evidence base we can call on. We rely on conducting our own UK science, and thus far we haven't done enough of that. We haven't invested enough in that to give a robust answer. The issue is even further complicated because even if we did have a perfect greenhouse gas budget for an individual afforested peatland site, the true climate change implications go beyond that site scale, because when we're afforesting a peatland, we're creating a product, we're creating a wood product, and that wood may be burnt, and if it's used for energy, it may compete against fossil fuels. That wood may be used for construction, in which case it might compete against more carbon intensive construction materials like concrete. That wood production may also mitigate the transport emissions associated with importing timber produced overseas. So we really need that whole life cycle viewpoint in order to give a robust answer to the question. And at the moment, we just don't have that data. The equal second most popular question in our survey was, is it possible to have trees on peat without loss of biodiversity and carbon storage? And I think the context to this question is strongly in Scotland, particularly with the recent policy of creating peatland edge woodland, this habitat with native trees on our peatlands after we fell their current cover of non-native conifer species. And that concept is controversial. The concept is proposed with the aims to get the best of both worlds, while some, in particularly conservation organisations, fear that concept may actually deliver the worst of both worlds, not giving the habitat gains that we would hope for, while potentially continuing to impact on climate and also not producing a productive timber crop. So I think the answer to this question is in some respects simple, because in other parts of the world, peatlands do have trees on them, and those peatlands do host biodiversity that we value and store carbon. What is much less clear, however, is whether we can create a novel habitat from the starting point that we have. And this is something that is going to require close attention and monitoring, particularly as we start trying to establish these peatland edge woodland habitats. The next question was on the subject of peatland restoration. The question was, what are the limits to the achievability of forest-to-bog restoration in terms of factors such as peat condition, depth, and site extent? And I think the context of this question is that we are being increasingly ambitious in the UK in our aspirations for peatland restoration. Governments, conservation organisations, charitable organisations now have really ambitious targets for the amount of peatlands that we are going to restore, and much of that is restoring afforested sites. And there are questions about whether we can keep increasing that aspiration, whether there are limits to which peatlands we can restore. The peatland edge woodland concept is strongly predicated on the idea that it isn't practical to restore all peatlands. Many who practice peatland restoration would hold the view that most peatlands can be restored with sufficient resource. So perhaps rather than the strict limits to what is philosophically what is achievable, is the question of what is pragmatically achievable, what can we realistically do within budgetary constraints and practical constraints. The final question which came from the study is an interesting one, because it gives some insight into how we might make these decisions between our alternative land use options. The question was, what is the financial value of natural capital in natural and afforested peatlands, and how does this change with restoration? And I think this question shows that in terms of making these decisions, we obviously have to trade off different forms of natural and financial capital. And this question, which attracted considerable support, suggests that a framework in which we try to place financial value on that natural capital is one that is popular with many stakeholders involved in this issue. So to summarise, this issue of peatlands and trees in the UK uplands is one which is contentious and has for a long period of time continued to provoke strong opinions on both sides. It's clear that in the future we're going to need to make decisions about what we do with these areas, and those decisions are going to require trade-offs. The really strong result which comes from this study is that stakeholders from a very wide variety of backgrounds place particular weight on better understanding the impacts of our alternative land uses on climate. And currently, as scientists, we can't give a robust answer to that question. And this question is both scientifically complex, but it's also complicated because it is embedded in the whole socio-economic context of the timber production that we get from peatlands and what uses that is put to. In terms of how we make these decisions, the community showed support for a natural capital approach. So if you're interested in finding out more about this, I've obviously only been able to give a rather brief summary of the work we did, but the report is now available in 3 different formats. On the Valuing Nature project website, you can find the report in a very short and easily readable version and a very long and very difficult to read version. We have also more recently published the report in the form of a journal paper, which is a convenient intermediate length and might be a good starting point. So I'd like to really thank the Valuing Nature project for supporting our work. This has been a really interesting experience, both personally and for us as a research group. I'd like to thank the Leverhulme Trust, which has supported our research on this topic. And if you have any questions, please feel free to either provide them to Victoria through the chat function, or indeed to email me at a later date. My email is at the bottom right of your screen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. That was a really insightful presentation you gave us, and as a result you have got a few questions. So we'll start with a question from Deborah Dunsford. She asks, natural flood management includes extensive tree planting as an option. Should this avoid peatland?
The short answer, yes. It's a legal requirement that tree planting shouldn't happen on deep peat. That's in the Forestry Commission policy guidance. One of the main concerns for people about new planting of trees is that with moves towards rewilding and recreating deciduous and coniferous forests in many of our upland regions, that will incidentally be planted on peat, when most stakeholders are clear that there should not be new tree planting on deep peat.
Okay, thank you very much. And a question from Robert Cousin. What definition of deep peat was used in this work, i.e. 0.5 centimetres, 1 metre, 2 metres, etc.?
Well, that's a very good question. The Forestry Commission has a formal definition of what they mean by deep peat, which actually I don't have on the tip of my tongue right now, somewhat embarrassingly. One of the problems of doing research in this area is that the terms used have different definitions. So peat and peatlands are defined in different ways between the different nations of the UK and between the Forestry Commission and other organisations. How we define a forest is again complex. So it's a very valid question. What do we mean by deep peat? But in terms of the Forestry Commission guidance, there is a specific answer to that.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I've got a question here from Joe Leeper. What are some of the known benefits of forest-to-bog peatland restoration? Or what are the main issues with tree planting on peat?
Sorry, I didn't entirely hear you, Victoria. Please could you repeat that?
Yep, sorry about that. What are some of the known benefits of forest-to-bog peatland restoration? Or what are the main issues with tree planting on peat?
Well, this is a contentious area, so it's difficult to give simple answers to that. I think most people in the community would be reasonably confident that we will get biodiversity benefits from forest-to-bog restoration. One of the issues with habitat restoration, particularly in terms of peatlands, is that it takes a very long time to see results. So when we think about the ecosystem of the peatland, we really need to think about it on long time scales, on centuries and millennia. But even the oldest peatland restoration in the UK is little more than 20 years old. Those sites are still very different to natural peatlands, but we have seen many benefits in terms of species recovery in those sites. Peatland restoration is also justified in terms of climate change mitigation, and that is a much more contentious area where different people from different disciplinary and stakeholder backgrounds strongly disagree on the nature of the evidence. So it depends which form of natural capital we're interested in. Biodiversity is perhaps our best argument for the value of peatland restoration, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Joe. And I have a question from Frank Tarkowski. Thanks for the presentation, Richard. Are there any other elements of the carbon balance worth thinking about in this context? Perhaps impacts on the DOC balance and implications for water treatment or aquatic ecology?
Yes, indeed. The aquatic carbon fluxes are clearly very important, and there is work going on at the moment to try and quantify them. One of the real gaps that we have is that nobody was measuring carbon fluxes at the point when the trees were first planted, and it's now no longer permitted to plant trees on deep peat. So we have no real way of knowing what the carbon fluxes would have been in that initial phase when the trees were planted. And those emissions were probably quite considerable because, as you saw in the slide, we were driving ploughs through pristine peatlands, heavily disturbing that surface environment, and one would assume losing lots of carbon through DOC and POC. And the trees that we now fell for timber obviously embed those emissions which were accrued at the point when the trees were planted. So it's certainly the case that the aquatic component of the carbon budget is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. So next question is from Alessandro Germana, sorry. Are value and trade-offs going to be examined only using economic methods? This would seem like a very narrow definition of value and use of methods.
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, it's not me who will be making these decisions. I think our study showed that there is some support in the community for financial valuation as a tool, but I totally agree with the question there that it would be very short-sighted to rely on that as the sole way of making this decision.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have another question here from Emma Brown. What is the final aim of forest-to-bog restoration? For example, a carbon sink or certain species present?
Well, that's an answer that all depends on who's doing the peatland restoration and for what purpose. Lots of the investment in peatland restoration through agri-environment schemes is explicitly focused on climate change mitigation, but then large amounts of restoration is also done by conservation organisations like the RSPB and the wildlife trusts, and that restoration is clearly justified to a large extent, although not exclusively, in terms of promoting the recovery of biodiversity. So there are different agendas by different people pursuing peatland restoration. There isn't a single response, but climate change and climate change mitigation and biodiversity are two arguments that are commonly used in this context.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. And I'm going back to Deborah Dunsford. She's got another question for you, which is, do you have any idea of how much of this research is transferable to lowland peat areas?
Yes, I should say, I mean, I've talked primarily about upland peat because that is the largest proportion of UK peat, but actually there's some evidence that lowland sites may proportionally be more affected by afforestation than uplands. So clearly that is an important part of the picture. The evidence that we took into producing this report was any evidence we could find on these topics, and that includes some lowland sites. In our own research, in our research group, we are looking at lowland sites and peatland restoration in particularly we're working at Fens and Wixall Moss, which is a large peatland complex on the English-Welsh border, and that's lowland peat. So yes, the issues may be slightly different between the uplands and lowlands, but clearly, yes, both are also important.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And there was one final question, which is how influential has the sporting, such as grouse shooting, interest been?
Well, grouse shooting is interesting because it's one of the other contentious issues in our peatland environments. Of course, for grouse shooting, the sites that we're talking about, the afforested sites, are not the sites where that is being practiced. So there are a whole load of other issues around moorland burning and grouse moor management in the UK uplands, but that hasn't been our specific focus in this project, really.
Okay, actually, we've got some more questions coming in now. How well understood are, this is from Shona Morton, how well understood are the relative merits of afforested and restored peatland for water quality and flood mitigation?
Yes, so in terms of water quality, there is some evidence on this, and there is more research underway to try and get a better handle on how water quality changes with afforestation, and particularly with forest-to-bog peatland restoration. So we have some evidence on that, and that's particularly promoted by concerns about fisheries, particularly in northern Scotland, where peatland deforestation was most widespread. Lots of these rivers are salmon rivers, and clearly that salmon fishing has an important economic role in those areas. So there's work going on by many of my colleagues on that topic. The question of flood amelioration is an interesting one. Flooding is an issue that did come through the project. It was a question that was maybe in about 6th place in our priority order, not in the top 5 I've talked about today. And it's a question that, as far as we have been able to ascertain, there is absolutely no direct evidence on in the UK at all. So personally, I would be really, really interested to know what happens to flood risk between our different land uses, and particularly when we're proposing forest-to-bog peatland restoration. So a very interesting question, but one that we can't say anything very meaningful about at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'll pass over to Anita to wrap this up, I think, unless anybody has any other questions they'd like to ask.
Okay, let's wrap up then. Thank you so much, Richard, for that fascinating presentation. I mean, I'm really seeing you've got across the value of these habitats, the complexity of the issues involved there, and the fact that it's just such a contentious area, both through time and currently, with where we go next. So you've really highlighted an area where we urgently need better understanding. So thank you so much for your input on that one. Thanks to everybody who's attended, and particularly those who asked questions. I understand that Richard will be happy to answer any further questions, so his email address is up on the screen, so please do contact Richard direct on that. And finally, great thank you to Victoria for fielding all those questions for us. We really appreciate that. Please do come along to any other Natural Capital webinars you're interested in, and don't forget to download those reports from our website. Thanks very much. We'll close now. Goodbye.